Her name was Sahara, and the first thing the desert stole from her was the sound of her own breath. That faint rasp, the dry, abrasive scratch of sand against her throat, will follow us through this entire story because it followed her through her final hours. It is the sound of a punishment so methodical, so deliberately slow, that even the desert seemed forced into complicity. We begin at dawn. Not the soft rose-colored dawn painted on tourist brochures, but the pale, indifferent light that creeps across the dunes like a witness refusing to intervene. Sahara stands surrounded by priests whose linen robes rustle with ritual authority. She is accused of something the state calls unspeakable, stealing from a temple storehouse and whispering forbidden knowledge to a man she loved. Whether she did any of it is almost irrelevant. In ancient Egypt, women who cross sacred hierarchies often found themselves guilty by existence alone. And standing there, facing her accusers, Sahara knows it. The desert pit has already been dug. Shallow, narrow, measured with the precision of engineers and executioners. She's pushed toward it as the morning wind brushes past her cheeks, and with it comes that unmistakable sensation, the scratch of sand, tiny grains scraping lightly across her skin as if testing how easily they might claim her. This is where our paradox begins. A civilization celebrated for granaries, irrigation, and the taming of nature also perfected a punishment built entirely on letting nature devour a human being. Tonight, we will expose how a revered religious state turned the very earth it worshipped into a weapon. You will hear three things in this investigation. First, how this execution worked with clockwork cruelty, grain by grain. Second, why the priesthood reserved it specifically for women accused of betrayal. And third, how the desert itself remembers what the official records tried to erase. But before we uncover any of that, we stay with Sahara. The priests lower her into the pit, forcing her legs together, pressing the heels of her feet into burning sand that hasn't yet faced the full force of the day. They pack her in upright, hands pinned to her side beneath the rising weight. Only her head remains above ground, exposed, vulnerable, framed by a sky entirely too large for a dying person to look at. And around her, that ever-present sound, the wind whispering, carrying those tiny, scraping grains that brush her eyelids and lips. A dry, intimate violation. Some say the desert punishes no one. It merely reveals what people are willing to do. But the priests performing this ritual correction seem to revel in its symbolism. Egypt, in their eyes, is order. The desert is chaos. And the woman who breaks their rules must be surrendered to chaos as proof that the balance has been restored. Yet Sahara doesn't look chaotic. She looks heartbreakingly human. A person who loved, feared, dreamed, and who now watches the sun climb higher while the sand at her chin shifts with every measured pour. Not dumped, not shoveled, but poured, like an offering. Like a reminder that control is best displayed slowly. As the sand rises, Sahara tries to breathe shallowly, but each inhale pulls in a few more grains. She coughs, and the sound is fragile, almost childlike. That same rasp, the dry, abrasive scratch of sand against her throat, grows louder in her mind. Wind stings her cheeks. Ants crawl over her scalp. She closes her eyes for relief and immediately feels sand collect in the corners of her lashes. This is the moment her voice cracks. Not from pain, Not yet. But from the realization that she has entered a death engineered to last long enough for reflection, long enough for fear to bloom into understanding, and long enough to make her wonder if anyone will ever speak her name again.
The mechanism was simple, and that simplicity was its cruelty. The priest called it returning the body to the earth, but what they meant was far more calculated. Sahara's burial wasn't an execution by force. It was an execution by inevitability, and that's what made it political. The desert sun rises fast, and with it, the temperature. Beneath the surface, the sand around Sahara heats like a kiln. Her skin begins to prickle, then burn, and every tiny shift of the wind drags another dry wave of grains across her exposed face. That constant scratch of sand against her lips, her nose, her eyelids, it becomes a rhythm, an unwanted heartbeat, reminding her she can't wipe it away. This punishment wasn't a product of rage or chaos. It was a tool of control perfected by the priestly bureaucracy. Women accused of temple theft, adultery tied to religious property, or worst of all, sharing sacred knowledge with outsiders were considered threats to cosmic order. Ma'at had to be restored, and public fear had to be maintained. So the priesthood crafted a punishment that looked like nature acting on its own, even though every moment was engineered by human hands. Sahara's arms, pinned beneath the rising sand, start to numb. Her feet, buried deeper, feel as though they're being roasted. She tries to shift her weight, but the sand holds her like a vice. The priests pour more, slowly, always slowly. Each movement is deliberate, ceremonial. They do not speak to her, they chant to each other. And over it all, the wind carries that abrasive whisper, the scratch of sand sliding along her teeth whenever she tries to breathe through her mouth. The motive behind this ritual is rarely written in official records, but the logic is undeniable. A woman who learned too much about temple inventory numbers, who noticed discrepancies in grain distributions, who questioned why priests lived with abundance while villages begged for water, that woman became dangerous. Knowledge and the system was treason, and treason demanded a death that made an example of the body. The sand rises past Sahara's ribcage. Her lungs struggle to expand. She calls for water, a simple human plea, and the priests ignore her. Not out of sadism, but out of conviction. And their doctrine, a woman who disrupts order, doesn't deserve relief. She deserves silence. They are not killing her. They are letting the desert judge her. A convenient absolution for men who designed every second of her suffering. The ritual manual describes the sand as a purifier. That's the official term, purifier. But in practice, it behaves more like a slow suffocation device. The grains slip into every crease of Sahara's clothing, then into her mouth when she gasps, into her nostrils when she tries to breathe, into her eyes when she blinks. Some executions use coarser gravel, but the priest chose fine desert sand for her. The kind that clings, the kind that infiltrates, the kind that turns inward. Ants crawl across her cheeks and gather at the edges of her hairline. One disappears beneath a buried sandline, then another. A scorpion tests her shoulder. She cannot flinch. The crowd that gather to watch murmurs, uneasy but obedient. They see a woman punished. They don't see a system pruning its threats. And above them all, rise the white walls of the temple granaries, full, heavy, protected. The irony isn't lost on Sahara. She starves for breath, while surplus grain sits locked behind stone. The priests continue pouring. Her breathing grows desperate. Every inhale carries a scratch of sand, deeper now, scraping her throat raw. Her vision blurs. The chants rise. The sun climbs. And the system that created this ritual stands unchanged. Because the purpose of her death isn't to punish what she did. It's to warn every woman watching what happens when she learns too much. And the desert is only beginning its work.
By midday, the desert has claimed authority over Sahara's senses. Her skin burns, Her breath rasps, and the priests who orchestrated her punishment step back as if absolved. They've done their part. Now they wait. The crowd waits. And Sahara, immobilized, half-buried, and choking on the scratch of sand slipping into her lungs, waits for something even she cannot name. But this is where the story fractures, because every official record claims that victims of this punishment simply passed into the embrace of the earth, peaceful, inevitable, unquestioned. Yet eyewitness accounts uncovered centuries later tell a different truth, one the priesthood tried and failed to suppress. Sahara does not fade quietly. She fights. As the sun reaches its apex, light refracts off the dunes, turning her exposed face into a lens of pain. Her lips crack. Her hair clings to her sweat. She tries to twist, to rock her body, to create even the smallest gap between her ribs and the sand. The crowd shifts. They're not supposed to see this part. The moment when the desert's indifference becomes unmistakably human in its brutality. A gust of wind sweeps across her face, driving a thin veil of grain against her cheek. The scratch of sand builds into a rapid-fire sting. She gasps, a fatal mistake, and inhales a lungful of dust. She coughs, choking, eyes watering, vision swimming. Some in the crowd turn away. Others watch with morbid obedience, knowing they cannot intervene. Still, she keeps fighting. Because here is the shock the priesthood never acknowledged. These women did not die of heat or thirst alone. Many died of collapse. The moment when the sand beneath them shifted just enough to sink a few inches deeper. The moment their burial tightened its grip. And for Sahara, that moment comes like a betrayal from the earth itself. A faint tremor ripples through the dune. Maybe from the shifting wind, maybe from distant footsteps, maybe from nothing at all. But it's enough. The sand line around her chest sinks suddenly, just an inch, maybe two, but it's catastrophic. Her lungs compress. She wheezes, inhaling more grains. The scratch of sand inside her throat becomes a violent scrape, raw and immediate. The priests don't react. They don't move. Their ritual demands observation, not mercy. But someone else does. A young acolyte, barely more than a boy, breaks formation. His eyes widen at the sight of Sahara's head jerking forward with each desperate cough. He steps closer, hands trembling, whispering that this isn't right. This isn't what the gods want. The older priest sees him, drag him back, silence him with threats. And as he struggles, he becomes our first recorded witness to what unfolds next. Because the next shock is not Sahara's suffering, it's her defiance. Her voice, cracked and filled with sand, escapes in a sound described by the acolyte as neither a scream nor a prayer, but something in between. Words half-formed, a sentence incomplete. Something about the grain stores, something about lies, something the priesthood never wanted spoken aloud. Even choking, even dying, she tries to expose the corruption she uncovered. The missing rations, the falsified tallies, the hidden debts disguised as divine will. And the priesthood panics. One priest steps forward, not to help her, not to silence her, but to drown her voice in more sand. He orders the attendants to pour faster. The ceremony breaks. The controlled pace collapses. Sand cascades over her shoulders, up her neck, past her jaw. She lifts her chin instinctively, trying to keep her mouth above the rising slope, trying to protect the last thing she still owns, her voice. But the avalanche keeps coming. Her eyes flutter, her breath stutters. The scratch of sand fills her mouth, her nose, her final inhale, and the desert closes over her. By sunset, the priest will claim she died quietly, but the acolyte's hidden account tells us that Sahara did not go willingly into silence. She tried to expose a system built on fear, a system that relied on the desert for plausible deniability. And her struggle, grain by grain, will return to haunt them.
The desert held Sahara's body, but it could not contain the consequences of her death. Not forever. Because systems built on silence always overlook one thing: the persistence of witnesses. And the young acolyte who watched her final moment did something the priesthood never anticipated. He remembered. Years later, long after the officials had sealed the temple records and scrubbed Sahara's name from every tablet, he confessed what he saw to a group of scribes loyal not to the priesthood but to truth. They wrote his testimony in the margins of unrelated manuscripts, hiding it where censors would never think to look. Those fragments, scattered, anonymous, coded in euphemisms, formed the earliest whispers of resistance against the ritual. And in each retelling, one detail returned like an echo of guilt: the scratch of sand, which haunted the moment her voice was buried. Those scribes wrote it as a metaphor, a symbol of a system scraping at the throat of any woman who dared to speak. The ritual didn't vanish overnight. Systems rarely do, but the doubts that Sahara ignited, the rumors of missing grain, the whispers that priests used divine punishment to cover financial corruption, began to circulate. Quietly at first, then boldly, then dangerously. A generation later, the practice of desert burial was discouraged. 2 generations after that, it was outlawed. Not because the state found compassion, but because it found fear. Fear of scrutiny, fear of exposure, fear that another Sahara might live long enough to speak her truth before the sand took her voice. And yet, even with the ritual abolished, the desert remained. The power structures remained. The belief that certain voices were expendable remained. This is the part that matters most now. Cruelty endorsed by institutions doesn't disappear. It adapts, it shifts, it finds new vocabulary. The system that once weaponized the desert now lives on in different forms, in the silencing of whistleblowers, and the punishment of women who question authority, and the rewriting of laws to look like rituals of order and stability. Because what killed Sahara was not sound, it was a hierarchy designed to preserve itself at any cost. And if we're honest, we still see its shadows everywhere. Any place where truth is treated as a threat, the desert returns. Any courtroom where a woman's voice is dismissed, the desert returns. Any institution that protects its own by burying its victims in paperwork, rumors, or shame, the desert returns. The scratch of sand becomes a metaphor for every slow, grinding mechanism built to erode courage grain by grain. And this is where we turn the lens towards ourselves. Imagine Sahara standing in that pit, terrified, furious, determined, and ask how many people around her thought they had no power to intervene. How many stayed silent because the system convinced them that silence was safety? How many believed the ritual was unchangeable, eternal? History proves it wasn't. The system fell. The ritual ended, not through divine decree, but because ordinary people finally refused to let fear dictate truth. So here in the last minutes of our investigation, we honor Sahara not as a victim of the desert, but as the woman whose final breath cracked the illusion of priestly perfection. Her struggle forced a reckoning. Her memory forced a reform. And her story, once buried, rises now. Because someone preserved it. Someone refused to let the sand swallow everything. And that leaves us with one last uncomfortable question. When a system begins to bury someone grain by grain, how long do we pretend not to notice? If you want more stories like this, stories scraped out of forgotten archives, stories meant to unsettle the comfortable, stay with Crimson Archive. Subscribe, share, and help us uncover the histories that were never meant to be heard.